So this is the last part of the monkey's paw, part 3. Before I start, did you notice in the last section when she saw the mother saw the man coming up the walk toward the house, she took off her apron real quick and she hid it under the cushions of the sofa. So remember, one of the themes is domesticity, like the happy home, the hominess, as opposed to the outside world. So her kind of that apron is such a symbol of home, and her hiding it means something, right? As this person is coming to the door, maybe the loss of the happy home is imminent. And we found out that the son had died at work, and so yes, that is what happened. All right, section 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles away, the old people buried their dead and came back to the house, which was now full of shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of waiting for something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But as the days passed and they realized that they had to accept the situation, the hopeless acceptance of the old, sometimes they hardly said a word to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to tiredness. It was about a week after the old man, I'm sorry, let me start that again. It was about a week after that, the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and he could hear the sound of his wife crying quietly at the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, who began crying again. The sounds of crying died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He slept lightly at first, and then was fully asleep until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She almost fell as she came hurried across the room toward him. "I won it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it?" "It's in the living room on the shelf above the fireplace," he replied. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied quickly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded angrily. "No," she cried excitedly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and threw the blankets from his shaking legs. "Good God, you're mad!" he cried, struck with horror. "Get it," she said, breathing quickly. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman desperately. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," said the old man. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, shaking with excitement. The old man turned and looked at her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you before, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" So he's saying that because of the accident where the boy worked, he was somehow really destroyed, and so the father could only recognize him by the clothes that were there. So how is he going to look that and 10 days after that dead? So it's a pretty reasonable thought the husband is having, I would say. "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and pulled him towards the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in its place on the shelf, and then a horrible fear came over him that the unspoken wish might bring the broken body of his son before him, before he could escape from the room. He caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His forehead cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and along the walls until he found himself at the bottom of the stairs with the evil thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he said weakly. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair, and the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and opened the curtains. He sat until he could no longer bear the cold, looking up from time to time at the figure of his wife staring through the window. The candle, which had almost burned to the bottom, was throwing moving shadows around the room. When the candle finally went out, the old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, went slowly back to his bed. And a minute afterward, the old woman came silently and lay without movement beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. They heard nothing else other than the normal night sounds. The darkness was depressing, and after lying for some time building up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, lighting one, went downstairs for another candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he stopped to light another, and at the same moment a knock sounded on the front door. It was so quiet that it could only be heard downstairs, as if the one knocking wanted to keep their coming a secret. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not even breathing, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and ran quickly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, sitting up quickly. "A rat," said the old man shakily. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock echoed throughout the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was there before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he asked in a low, scared voice. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling automatically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, shaking with fear. "You are afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock and another. The old woman, with a sudden pull, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the top of the stairs and called after her as she hurried down. He heard the chain pulled back and the bottom lock open. Then the old woman's voice, desperate and breathing heavily. "The top lock," she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, feeling around wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. The knocks came very quickly, now echoing through the house, and he heard the noise of his wife moving a chair and putting it down against the door. He heard the movement of the lock as she began to open it, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled back and the door opened. A cold wind blew up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and pain from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate. The street light opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. That is the end of the story. So, what was that third wish? Obviously, he wished for the son to not be there, and that was probably a really excellent wish on his part. So, all the things that happened in threes, did you pick up on them as we went through the story? So I'll tell you what they were. So the monkey's paw was the first thing. How many wishes do you get? On the monkey's paw, you get 3 wishes. How many owners of the monkey's paw were there total? There was the man who brought it when he came for dinner that night. There was the person who had given it to him, and then there was this family. So 3 owners of the monkey's paw, 3 wishes. The White family is made up of 3 people, the mother, the father, and the son, Herbert. the guest, Mr. Sergeant Major Morris, began talking about his adventures in India after he had had 3 glasses of whiskey, and he urges Mr. White 3 times to not wish on the paw. When the man came from Ma and Megan's to tell the father and mother that their son had been killed, he came to the gate 3 times and turned back before he finally allowed himself to come to the door. Mrs. White orders her husband 3 times to wish Herbert alive again before he goes and gets the paw. And the corpse of Herbert, we're presuming who was at the door, knocks 3 times before his mother hears him. The story is broken up into 3 parts. We've already talked about that. You might not have noticed this, but it takes place 3 times of day during 3 types of weather. So part 1 was in the evening, and it was during a rainstorm. Part 2 was during the morning of a bright winter day. And part 3 is set in the middle of a chilly, windy night. All right, so you guys have all heard the phrase, I would think, that bad luck or bad things happen in 3s. So I'm sure the author had that in mind when he came up with this story. So I wanted to say a little bit about the chess game too, and that's the last thing that we'll talk about with this story. So chess symbolizes life in the monkey's paw. And those who play a daring, risky game of chess will lose, just like those who take unnecessary risks in life will lose, or will die, possibly. So when the story opens, Mr. White and his son Herbert are playing chess by the fire, and the game's outcome mirrors what's going to happen in the story. Mr. White takes terrible, unnecessary risks as he's playing this chess game with his son. He takes an unnecessary risk with his king, and those risks make his wife nervous as she's watching the game of chess. As he plays, he notices that he has made a very bad mistake with his king that will prove deadly. That's going to make him lose the game. And the risks and mistakes that Mr. White makes during that chess game parallel the risks that he makes with the monkey's paw, the risk that he takes with the monkey's paw. These mistakes ultimately lead to Herbert's death. So that chess game is foreshadowing for how the rest of the story is going to unfold once the monkey's paw comes into play. Hope you enjoyed it. It's a great story. Thanks for listening.